Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Um, yeah, here we go. Okay, so today we are talking about Edward Manet. There's a pretty nice through line between Courbet and Manet. And if Courbet is seen as this kind of transitional figure between academic art and modern art, then Manet is traditionally seen as kind of like the father of modern art, if you put any stock in things like that. So I am showing you a photograph of him on the left and a portrait of him on the right. The photograph is by a photographer named Nadir, Nadir, and he was quite famous in his own right, and to some extent kind of created the whole, I don't know, kind of idea of celebrity culture. Like he was very famous for making portraits of celebrities and then mass producing them so regular people could buy them and admire them. And the portrait on the right is by a fellow painter named Fantine Latour, and we'll see a few of his works very soon. So, Fenton Latour was most known for group portraits and still lifes of flowers. And this early group portrait is basically a bunch of kind of like fanboys. They're mainly writers and poets, with the exception of the artist himself right here, Fantine. This is a British modernist artist, James Whistler. You might have heard of Whistler's mother, but quite a famous modernist in his own right. And then here is Manet, and they are surrounding a portrait of a French artist named Delacroix. Delacroix is associated with the movements of Romanticism and Orientalism. Um, but to some extent, he kind of serves as a model for what modernism could be. Um, so I'm showing you a self-portrait on the left, and then on the right is a painting that you're probably familiar with. Um, it is a kind of allegorical image of something called the Commune, which was a armed revolt that happened in Paris in the 1830s. But it kind of shows you a spectrum of different social classes, from kind of working class to middle class, all surrounding this allegorical figure of France in the form of a woman. So it's a kind of combination of history painting of the present moment with aspects of a more kind of traditional history painting, but just taking the contemporary world as a worthy subject matter seems kind of modernist. We have works like this by Delacroix, which are really about kind of intense emotion and drama and kind of excess. So, I mean, in some ways it's following academic standards, but in other ways it's kind of over the top and incredibly sort of emotionally charged, which is often associated with romanticism. Or, and I'm showing you a photographic portrait of him here, or you have, again, a kind of history painting of the present. So this is a image of the Turkish invasion of Greece, and it is in some ways quite traditional, but also it was a historical event that's happening at the time. So he's using many of the techniques of academic painting to comment on things that are happening in the very moment he's painting them. Um, so there are some things here that the modernists are really interested in, looking at the world around you, kind of coming up with a very sort of rich kind of expression with painting, a kind of boldness in design, right? So I showed you this group portrait of 1864, where Manet is just one of many sort of devotees of Delacroix. Um, but around 1864, Manet has been kind of known to the public as a painter for just a couple years. Um, when we look at this second group portrait by Fantin Latour from 79, so about 15 years later, Manet is the kind of father figure. Um, Instead of a portrait of him, he is painting and he is surrounded by a group of young men of the kind of the generation younger than him. And they are looking to him as a source of inspiration. So in the same way that Manet was trying to make a name for himself in that first portrait, you have this group of artists who will become known as the Impressionists. But at this point, they're very much looking to Manet as a kind of model for how art can address the world around them, how art can sort of expand the notion of what art can be. Um, there's a boldness to Manet that we'll be talking about, engaging with the public in terms of controversy, sort of a manufactured controversy. But yeah, so I think it shows nicely the concept that I talked about, where what is modern in one time is not modern, you know, 20 years later, right? Modernism is a constant sort of looking at it, what has come before, both in terms of tradition and in terms of most recent artists, and then kind of pushing it forward from there. So I don't know, I find it kind of interesting to see Manet put in the role of teacher, even though I don't really think I don't know how much he would have accepted that kind of role. Okay. Um, so Manet was the child of a government official. His father wanted him to join the Navy, but after several attempts, failed attempts, he was not accepted there, and so Manet chose to become an artist. He studied under an academic painter named Thomas Couture. I'm showing you two paintings by Couture. I've selected these two because you can see them at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Um, there's a little bit of a, sort of a boldness and originality in terms of his color, but in terms of his draftsmanship, composition, subject matter, fairly traditional and conservative. So Manet learned a lot of skills uh, from Couture, developed a kind of foundation in terms of what was expected from painters in Paris at this time, but quickly grew kind of dissatisfied with this sort of apprenticeship, found it quite kind of limiting, and increasingly he started doing what Courbet did, which was going to the Louvre and looking at old masters and looking for inspiration outside of his immediate circle, um, and was really interested in Spanish artists. He eventually did go to Spain just once in his life in 1865, although he had admired Spanish painters before this, but was a real lover of Velázquez. I'm showing you a portrait that Velázquez did on the right. Um, he really is able to capture the humanity of his subjects, but there's also a kind of ambiguity to them. They're portraits which very much engage the viewer and make it's a very kind of self-conscious work of art. Like it calls attention to the fact that it is a painting. It calls the viewer's attention to the fact that it's a constructed thing, right? The man in the portrait seems to exist on almost this kind of theatrical backdrop, which in this case makes sense because he was an actor, but it calls attention to this mode of presentation that's part of a lot of portraits, which academic painting tried to kind of obscure, but here it takes advantage of that. Um, and there's a quite obvious connection between a work like this by Velázquez and some of Manet's first kind of original works. So we're not looking at his student work that he did under Couture, but I want to start with some of his first kind of unique, sort of creative investigations into what kind of painter he may be. Um, so he combines a few things together. And at the same time that Manet is sort of emerging as an artist in his own right, there is a writer who becomes quite important in telling the story of Manet. If you go back to that first group portrait, you'll see this figure on the very far right. His name is Charles Baudelaire. Here's a portrait of him, also by Nadir. Um, Baudelaire was a poet. He's quite famous within the history of poetry for this collection of poems called Fleur de Mal. Um, He was a big influence on people like Edgar Allan Poe. So there's a very kind of dark, gritty quality to a lot of his work. Um, but in terms of our subject here today, I've wanted to call your attention to a article that he wrote in a Parisian newspaper. So Baudelaire was also an art critic as well as an artist in his own right. And he would like critique the salon, for instance. But this is more sort of an opinion piece. So the article is called The Painter of Modern Life. And basically, in this writing, Baudelaire is looking for a new type of painter, a painter that will take the world around him as a subject. Um, we talked about like Delacroix, making history paintings of the present moment, but they were wars, they were these big dramatic things that people were talking about. They were, in some ways, they were not that far apart from kind of traditional history painting because they were depicting warfare. They had a kind of obvious moral message. When you look through his paintings, there was an obvious kind of, to put it simply, sort of like good guy and bad guy, right? Dynamic setup. But there was a lot of drama and, death and all that kind of big dramatic stuff that history painting is usually associated with. But what Baudelaire is looking for is a painter who will simply paint the world around them, a painter of modern life. And he wants the artist to almost be a kind of anthropologist of his own culture, like try to make sense of the strange things that are happening in the city of Paris. Um, the weird kind of like social mixing that's happening because more and more people are moving into cities, the new types of social spaces that are opening up. And he wants an artist that will explore every facet of society, including places that, I don't know, may not put France in the most complimentary light, right? He wants artists to depict the taverns and the brothels and the alleyways and, you know, maybe the things that traditional artists wouldn't put the spotlight on, but he seems to be saying that it's in that kind of gritty, maybe darker reality that we get closer to what the truth of living in the modern world is like. And the closest thing he can find is this guy named Constantine Guise, who, I mean, is not a well-known artist for probably a good reason, but I'm showing you here an image that he made of a sailor in a brothel, right? Which seems, even though it may not look very provocative to you, would have been quite provocative at the time. People would have immediately been able to figure out that these were prostitutes, and it just, I don't know, it would be shedding light on a part of society that most people who went to the salon didn't want to openly discuss or think about, even if they were part of that lifestyle. And so, to some extent, Manet comes in and fills the void of what Baudelaire is looking for. So, some of Manet's early kind of, I would call them sort of independent works in the sense that they're not under the tutelage of a teacher. They might be based on artists that he's influenced by, like Velázquez, but he's trying to kind of strike his own path. He does a series of paintings, which in many respects seem like portraits, and in another aspect seem more like types. And when I say types, I mean like think about if you were casting for a movie and you're looking for, I don't know, let's say a bully or a socialite or a cheerleader. A type is a sort of a person that stands in for a kind of demographic of similar people. So these paintings were most likely based on real people, but they were not commissioned by those people. And the models that were used are not cited in the title. Instead, we see an individual man, and the title is The Rag Picker, not a rag picker named blank, but The Rag Picker. And so although there are a lot of indications of kind of individuality, there's also a sense that he stands in for many other people like him. These are a series of portraits of people that you might encounter on the streets of Paris. So, if we're thinking about the painter of modern life, it's almost kind of like taking one little slice of the urban experience and isolating it and kind of putting it in focus, right? Um, Oftentimes, as we're walking through a crowded city, we're kind of overcome with so much stimulation. There's a speed to living in the city. There's a kind of chaos to living in the city. You're seeing a great kind of sea of humanity filled with so many different types of people doing different types of things. And it's easy to just get kind of overwhelmed by it or to just try to put your blinders on and concentrate on what you have to do. But in this series of portraits, he seems to be pulling people out of the crowd and isolating them so that we can kind of take time to look at them and think about them, or said another way, to consider them. And he's choosing particular kinds of people that the average middle class or upper middle class Parisian person would not give the time of day to, right? So I spent so much time talking about the Stonebreakers because not because of the particularity of the subject matter, but because of the kind of attitude behind its creation, right? It's forcing you to confront something that we don't want to think about. And this is very much in that same vein. So, this is an image of a man who is destitute, right? We can tell by the kind of shabby state of his clothing, that he's quite poor. Um, he's set on almost what looks to me like a photographic studio background, right? It's this almost kind of blank neutral space. And yet we have at the very bottom, there's this little pile of stuff which functions in a couple different ways. It acts as a kind of still life, albeit a kind of anti-still life. You know, usually you think of still life as elements that are composed to create a kind of beautiful composition. Here it seems to be a bunch of cast-off objects, you know, trash, broken bottles, food scraps, right? Um, and in the same way that this little pile of cast off things seems separated from the urban environment, so does this man. So they both kind of function like one aspect of the urban experience kind of taken in isolation, and meant to stand for a great many similar things, right? Um, they also seem to stand in or kind of focus you on his lack of material possessions. Many paintings of wealthy people seem like an opportunity for them to catalog their material wealth, right? So it's as much about showing off what they own as it is about saying something about the individual person. But here we have a real lack of possessions. And what is a rag picker? Sometimes they were called rag and bone men. Um, it would be the equivalent of seeing a homeless person today who is going through a garbage can and looking for cans and bottles and collecting these cans and bottles so that they can turn them in for a little bit of money from a recycling center, right? So the rag picker was someone who literally collected rags. Textiles were very expensive, even if they were poorly made. And so textiles were something that could be repurposed. A lot of paper was even made out of linen and things like that at this time, right? So the rag picker would go around and sift through garbage piles and look for cast off rags, that people had gotten rid of. Or they would even collect bones. Bones could be ground down and be part of several kinds of manufacturing, right? So they're collecting scraps. It's this sort of lowest level of subsistence. And I'm showing you a photograph by a Parisian photographer named Auger. And the rag picker was still a kind of type that you might see around the city of Paris, even at the turn of the century. So they are a person who is barely surviving. They seem to have no sort of connection with society at large. They're a kind of in the same way that the rags are cast off, they seem representative of a kind of people that is cast off by the transformation of the city. And these sweeping changes happen with the Industrial Revolution. Or you have an image of a person like this. And once again, they are not named. There are things about this figure which seem to speak to an individual, right? There, it seems like we are looking at a particular person, but it doesn't function in terms of a traditional portrait. Once again, he is not named by name, but he is named by type. He is reduced to a kind of action in the same way that the rag picker is reduced to a kind of action. Um, one of the reasons why, in terms of modern political correctness, we are trying to move away from the term homeless person to unhoused person is because when you say homeless person, it connotes that that is something kind of at the core of their personality. Like it's something that is intrinsic to them and that they are almost a different type of person who doesn't belong or doesn't share in the same sort of values that the rest of society shares, or at least that's the way it's often been interpreted. And something very similar is happening in these paintings. Um, by calling someone a rag picker, you are reducing all of the complexity of their individuality and their biography to to their current conditions, right? To what is immediately visible by a stranger walking by them, right? It is a way of dismissing not only this particular person, but the whole kind of demographic of similar people, right? And so Manet is using this convention not in a derisive way, but he's using it to point out to us that it's something that we do. Um, in the same way that the stone breakers both confronted you with labor, but also denied you access to see in their face, it it sort of reenacted a kind of willful blindness to labor. And here, this painting is sort of reenacting an attitude towards those which don't seem to conform to societal standards. Um, Increasingly, the language of capitalism will start to kind of infiltrate how we speak about things in general, right? And so when we look at a person like this, we will say they are not a productive member of society. They are not producing. They're not part of the kind of system of labor, and work that we hold to be a kind of moral value. And so it's a kind of moral criticism that a painting like this is reenacting. Similar to this painting, The Absinthe Drinker. We've taken away, no, Uh, all right. Apologize for the interruption. Domestic duties called me. Okay. All right. So, uh, as I was saying before, when we look at the absinthe drinker, we're reenacting a kind of situation in which we see someone on the street, or we catch a glimpse of someone in a dark alley who is sitting there alone by himself drinking. And we make this kind of immediate snap moral judgment where we condemn this person. Um, Not only for, maybe the sins of alcoholism, but caught up in that kind of judgment is that they have done certain things which have separated themselves from polite society, right? We don't look into the window of a fancy bar and condemn the people patronizing it. But when we see someone out of the kind of accepted spheres of consumption, let's say, we tend to view it with a certain kind of moral taint. Um, and it's easy to kind of dehumanize, right? Um, it's a way of making ourselves feel better about ourselves by dismissing others. And that's very much what Manet is trying to engage with, right? He's trying actually to put the focus back on ourselves and how we've been conditioned to treat others and to some extent to a willful blindness of those. Once again, we have this kind of clever use of like the most bare minimum of still life. So in the previous painting, we saw a pile of rubbish. Here we have an empty bottle and a glass of absinthe. If you're not familiar with absinthe, it is an incredibly strong liquor. It has a higher alcohol percentage than most hard liquors, and it also is made with a substance called wormwood, which if you have enough of this drink, it has slightly psychoactive properties. When we look at his face, it's almost like we are looking through a kind of haze. So we almost like adopt a kind of feeling of intoxication. Uh, the drink absinthe was often called the Green Fairy. Um, If you've seen the Moulin Rouge movie, they make allusions to that. This is a famous advertising of absinthe at the time, but the Green Fairy was this idea that, if you drink enough of it, you kind of start hallucinating. Um, I just, I also partly put these two images together because they show a kind of a spectrum of how one might view the exact same thing. So on the left, you have advertising. It's an image made by a company to make a product seem appealing. And here they've sort of glommed on a kind of sensuality to the liquor, which really has nothing to do with it at all. But we see this continuing today in alcohol advertisements. Um, so there's this idea of like making the product seem as seductive as a woman. Um, a lot of times advertising makes a kind of false claim of sociality that you will become more interesting or social or liked by other people if you use the product. And then at the opposite spectrum, we have the same product, which has in its excess of use driven someone out of the kind of embrace of society. You might notice that he appears once again. Uh, this is a very odd painting, and it's meant to be odd. You might look at this and wonder not just who are these people, but how did these people find themselves together? And how did they find themselves together in this particular place? The last few paintings we've looked at have pulled certain figures out of the urban environment and kind of put them on display in isolation. But something very different is happening in this next painting. Not only do we wonder who are these individuals and why are they together, but what is this space that they occupy? Um, if you look at this painting for 2 seconds, you might think, oh, they're in nature, right? There's certain kind of visual cues of landscape, especially in like the top left quadrant, right? It has almost the kind of bare indications of what we would expect from landscape in the same way that he was giving us these kind of bare aspects of something that would count as still life. Right. But then once your eyes move from the nicely rendered leaves and the clouds and blue sky at the very top left of the painting, and you start to look around the rest of the landscape, it becomes very odd. And it becomes very obvious that what you are looking at is paint, right? There is a kind of illusionism that's happening here. But after you move away in any direction through this landscape, the illusion breaks down and it becomes quite obvious we are just looking at colored material that has been brushed on the surface of a canvas. Sometimes it's done quite thinly, so you can almost see the canvas underneath. Sometimes it's done in a way where we can imagine the actual movement of the brush making the mark. And then at other times, it seems like we are looking at a preliminary stage of painting, right? So they've sort of roughed in where the leaves are, but they haven't quite done the final detail work that will make them seem illusionistic. Right? So just in terms of how it's painted, it's very odd and it's very inconsistent. Um, it's almost like in this tiny little section, he's letting you know that he can do the thing that you are expecting to see within the genre of landscape. He can create illusion and he can create atmosphere and things like that. And that is put in stark contrast with the rest of the background, which very much calls our attention to the constructedness or maybe even the incompleteness, the kind of in-betweenness of the painting, that it's not fully formed, the kind of space that they occupy. Um, Many who looked at this painting would simply dismiss it as unfinished or ugly or lacking in skill. But I would like you to think about this as a choice to place these figures in a kind of nebulous, unfinished, almost unrecognizable space, right? That there's something meaningful about that. Um, Now, when we look at who is in this painting, it's often helpful to look at the title, right? So the title says that this painting is the old musician. We see a man with a gray beard and a violin, and so to some extent, we are trained to believe that he is the primary focus of this painting. And if we take that for granted, then we start to wonder why everyone else is around him. He doesn't seem to be performing. Um, is his status as a musician defined by the fact that he is holding an instrument? I mean, there seems to be something similar to what was happening where we call a person like this an absinthe drinker. We sort of reduce all of the complexity of who he is into the first kind of gut reaction when we see this person, right? So, oh, they're old and they have an instrument, they must be an old musician. But we don't get much context, which allows this to make sense. And then as we scan through the other people in this painting, we see our absinthe drinker, who now is not in a dark alleyway, but seems to be in the light of day. We see a figure in a robe with a long beard and a turban. We see two boys who seem to be friends. Their age is kind of hard to determine. Um, and then there is a female figure here who is shoeless. She has a hole in her dress, and she is carrying a child. These are demographics which don't really seem like they should exist in the same world. Um, there are whole genres of paintings of children. There are genres of paintings of non-Western folks and of musicians and of mothers, but they don't seem to add up to anything recognizable. Um, for instance, when we look at this female figure, is this a young girl holding a doll? Or is it a young mother holding a child? Or is it a sibling taking care of a younger sibling? Um, the lack of shoes and the kind of sorry state of her clothing would lead us to believe that she's poor. Um, Also, the fact that these children seem like they're maybe, I don't know, 8 or 9 years old and they're unaccompanied by adults who look related to them, that seems quite strange. It's almost like they're street urchins who are kind of making their way on their own. Um, Almost kind of like a miniature younger version of the absinthe drinker. Uh, no one seems to cohere with anyone else. And so, in the same way that the space that they occupy is odd and doesn't seem to have a rationale or a particularity to it, um, the same thing could be said of the people who occupy this space, right? Um, there are certain aspects of the landscape which seem like we are in nature. But when we look at the bottom half of this composition, it's not only muddy, but it looks like the ground has been leveled. Like it looks like there's been human intervention and human traffic, right? Which would negate the feeling that we are in nature. And yet, there are no cobblestones, there's no bricks, there's no signs of architecture. So there's a presence of humanity before these people came here, but there is not yet the feeling of civilization transforming nature, right? So we're somewhere in between the untouched natural world and the constructed man-made world. And that's very much what this painting is about. It is a collection of cast-off figures. These are figures that at one point we may have seen in the urban environment. But as it has transformed and as the center of Paris has been built up and has become more expensive and more regulated, these people that exist on the periphery of society are quite literally pushed out of the core, right? They are pushed to the edges of the city of Paris. And eventually they are pushed past the edges into this kind of no man's land. It's a kind of area around Paris where houses have not yet been built, but there is the expectation that with continued growth, the city will expand to fill that void. And so they are in this kind of limbo space. The painting is almost life-size in scale, right? So again, we are confronted in the same way that we're confronted when we look at the stone breakers. Um, but they are not quite so large that they loom over us. Um, but there are strange aspects of scale, right? Like one of the reasons it's difficult to determine the age of these boys is because they don't seem to be in proportion with the rest of the figures. They seem to be, I don't know, 10 or 20% larger in scale than the rest of these figures. There's an odd kind of collaged look to this work of art, which again is intentional, right? In the same way that the background has this sort of unfinished, ambiguous look, the weird juxtaposition of figures and the idea that they almost don't even exist in the same space at all, um, calls your attention to not only the constructedness of this painting, but also the very constructedness of Paris. Paris is in the middle of a kind of transformation, and it's not what it was, and it's not what it will be. It's somewhere in between. And these people without much agency or wealth have been pushed into this strange middle space. In the same way that we could look at this section here, which is fully realized in terms of like a traditional landscape, there are other aspects of inconsistency that are built into this painting, right? So we look at her feet, which usually feet are not the focus of a portrait, but the feet are very nicely rendered. But then you go just a few inches up, and her dress is quite obviously made with these overlapping brush strokes, right? So he's able to show you that he can do illusionism and call your attention to the fact that it is a painting at the very same time. There's a kind of shorthand that Manet is known for, right? Where daubs of a dark, almost black color, they kind of stand in for eyes, but also they may show you that this is a doll instead of a human being, right? Um, to some extent, it kind of makes you fill in the gaps in the painting, right? And by doing that, it almost makes you kind of complicit in the construction of this image. So when we think about Paris as Americans, um, these are the kind of things we think about. We often think about beautiful images coming from the Impressionist painters, or we think about kind of tourist photos of the center of Paris and these lovely vistas and these uniform facades of the apartments and, you know, these conspicuous kind of visual attractions that exist at, the kind of endpoints of these vistas, right? It's known for being a beautiful city. Um, because of our detachment from Paris and from the time period, we see Paris as this kind of inspiration for making art, which is true, but not necessarily in the way that you might think of. It's not like Paris is the muse for art. It's that the transformation of Paris is this bizarre, ambiguous, sometimes upsetting, sometimes exciting thing that's happening right around these artists at this time. And so now we have a kind of image of Paris that is fixed, especially from a kind of American point of view. And it's fixed visually by these paintings and by these kinds of photographs. But it's very important for you to try to get in the headspace at this time when these kinds of images are not set, but instead are coming into being. And by coming into being, other types of things are erased or obscured. If you look at Paris today from an airplane or a helicopter, you see these very mathematical grids and kind of spokes of streets, which organize space. They allow for easy walking of the city. Um, Again, these wide boulevards allow for these beautiful kind of vistas that you can gaze down. Um, they allow the city to be sort of visually understood. And we associate that quality of Paris with some of its charm. This idea of how we navigate the city of Paris is something that is coming into being at the very time that we're talking about. And it's happening through demolition. This man, Baron Haussmann, is, I mean, I could sort of say he's kind of like a city planner, but he had a lot more power than that. But basically, he's kind of looking at an existing map of Paris and drawing these lines. And because he's so powerful, these boulevards are basically bulldozing through existing communities, right? It was an attempt to get away from the kind of medieval patchwork, organic kind of organization of the city to something more rational and beautiful and sanitary and economically productive, right? Um, these types of roadways are for the easy transportation of goods and people, right? It's not just for the pleasure of walking as a tourist or a city dweller, but it's very much thinking about how can we make this a more rational, organized, economically viable city, right? Um, Also, these wide boulevards that are so associated with Paris, we think of them aesthetically today, but their other major role was solving a persistent problem in French history, which is revolution. So when we look at a painting like this, look at the bottom of the composition, and you see this great pile of material. This is a depiction of an older kind of street that was narrow and was filled with these cobblestones. And so during the time of revolution, citizens would make these things called barricades. They would basically dig up all of the cobblestones, they would pile furniture and whatever kind of material they could, and they would block the streets of Paris and use those as a way to prevent troops from coming in, but also as a kind of defensive structure that they might use to hide behind and shoot from, right? So the wide boulevards that were created by Haussmann are also anticipating the potential for the public to revolt, right? So it's as much about economic viability and a kind of clarity and rationality as it is political and military control, right? And so when we look at an image like this, we think it's all about beauty and light and openness, and maybe even some sort of quaintness, right? Like it seems maybe like an ideal urban environment in comparison to the kind of cities we live in today. But what undergirds all of the aesthetics of Paris are these larger forces at play. Um, Forces that seem to be beyond reckoning with, right? This idea that part of living in a city is living with forces beyond your control, um, feeling like you have a kind of lack of agency in how things happen, right? And so as this destruction and construction is taking place, there's a greater uniformity to what is being built, and there's a greater uniformity in terms of social expectations and in terms of street life. And so, oh, yes. And so a lot of Americans, when they go to Paris, are confronted by some of the uglier realities of it. Anyway, when we look at this painting, we're looking at the people that don't belong to a new vision of Paris. And so they have been kind of swept aside or pushed out of the center into the periphery so that we can create this new kind of aesthetic that is Paris. And one of the things that people like Baron Haussmann specifically were legislating against were street performers. So, to some extent, the old musician is representative of a demographic of people who sort of eked a living out playing music or doing puppet shows or juggling or, a variety of different forms of entertainment on the street, right? And once again, this is a photograph by Auger at the turn of the century. We also have the reoccurrence of this kind of figure of the wandering Jew. So it's not explicitly stated, but there is a kind of foreignness to his manner of dress, this long robe, the long beard, the turban. There's a feeling of otherness, and there's a feeling of this figure not belonging, and that's very much in dialogue with this kind of folklore of the wandering Jew, the kind of person who is ousted from the community, who doesn't belong, who is cursed to roam and travel and never kind of find a home of his own, right? And so he's not specifically talking about the wandering Jew, but he's using the wandering Jew as a metaphor for these people at the periphery of society who have been dismissed and pushed away. And so, what do you have once the undesirables are pushed out of the center? You have this unique opportunity for the display of middle and upper middle class conformity and status. And so, Manet really is the painter of modern life in that he is showing you the full spectrum of what it means to live in Paris. He's showing you the people that are Parisian, but now are sort of being dismissed as belonging. And then you have this influx of money and this aspiration for status, and the kind of social pressures of conformity associated with middle and upper middle class life. It's almost like all the men are wearing a uniform, right? Um, and you also, like the old musician, have this weird space, right? Where to some extent it looks like they're in nature, but then you see the very nice clothing that they're wearing and the furniture. I mean, there's so many sort of aspects of city life and a particular kind of city life based on pleasure and privilege, right? And it seems to be in stark juxtaposition with the sort of naturalness of the space that they occupy. Um, the Tuileries is a large garden in Paris. And so, in the same way that we are bulldozing old neighborhoods to create this new kind of aesthetic of urban living, there's also the desire to save aspects of nature and kind of bracket them and sanitize them, in the form of public parks. I find these two paintings to be an interesting pair in a variety of ways. They both seem to address music, and yet when you look beyond their title to the painting itself, there's a kind of silence to both of them. There's an absence of music actually being played. And it seems that we're actually more interested in the audience than we are in the performance. Or to put it in another way, that the audience is to some extent the ones performing. Um, Again, there is a kind of anxiety about class and about maintaining middle class respectability and conforming with the standards of the middle class. And so even though we are seeing people supposedly enjoying themselves, right? These are people who have the day off of work and they've gone to a park with their family to listen to music. It sounds like it should be a very fun and pleasant time, but the feeling of it does not convey that. It feels stiff and awkward and unnatural. And that's kind of the point, right? And I think that's where I'm going to end it because I would like to talk to you about the next couple major paintings by Manet in person. to see what your insights are, and also because they're the subject of your reading. So I hope you have a nice weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week. All right. Thanks for watching.